I used to also follow these lectures on the YouTube from other prominent professors. Lately, I was listening to Kant lectures by one of these Harvard professors. They also have 7 or 10 series of lectures on Immanuel Kant. So, Prof is among one of the top best lectures from the Muslim perspective. So we are so blessed to have these classes, alhamdulillah. So today Prof will talk another important figure in the philosophy of science, Karl Popper. So without, where's Prof Hazim? Still there? I think Prof just shut off for a while, so we'll wait for him. Oh, okay, Prof, you're coming back. Unmute, Prof, unmute.
Tadi people.
Thank you so much, alhamdulillah. So surely, Prof, we will repackage all this recording that we have from last series and this series, and inshallah we'll promote it to all the universities that we have such a very important lecture series so that they can use it in their classroom. So, Prof, without further ado, please go ahead with our third class.
Maybe Sharan, you can make the announcements first, yeah, about.
Oh yeah, okay. I've spoken with Prof before the class. So since the subject matter is so deep, so Prof need complete 1 hour to finish his slide presentation. So Prof has agreed that we will allocate the 8th class only for answering questions from the chat box and also the new question. So that's our format. Please feel free to write as many questions as possible in the chat box. Then Prof will compile it. On the 8 weeks, he will select most relevant question and he will answer it. And we'll also make it lively also. You can also ask during the class. Not now, we are controlling the audio, but on the 8th class, we will open it, inshallah. Okay, Prof? Prof line is not stable tonight. Coming back. Okay. Why is it, Prof? Any problem with the line?
Yeah, putus-putus. Okay. You want me to share the screen now, yeah?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, nampak tak?
Okay, nice.
Okay, since it's already 9:34, I'll just start now.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you, Brother Sharan. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So, this week is the 3rd week of my lecture series. And tonight I'll be speaking on Karl Popper's philosophy of science. Yeah? But before that, I'd just like to add on to what Sharan has said earlier about the 8th week. Yeah, because this lecture is projected to be only for 7 weeks. Yeah, but since I could not take questions at the end of the class of each week, and I know that there have been questions from participants. So since I don't feel nice about not responding to your questions, I will finish the series of lectures in 7 weeks, and then I will add 1 more week. Yeah, and that 8th week will be devoted to Q&A only. Yeah, so you can compile your questions. Yeah, and then ask me on the 8th week, or you can post questions each week, and then Sharan will probably collect them. And of course, I cannot answer all of them because there are 8 weeks of lectures. Yeah, but I will try and do my best. Yeah, and perhaps if I could not respond to you verbally online, then perhaps you can email to me, and I will give the email address later. Yeah. So I hope that will set your minds to rest regarding waiting responses from me. I do welcome questions, but as I've said, time is limited. Yeah, and I'm bound to the time limit that has been set on me. Yeah. Okay, so without further ado, let me go on to tonight's lecture, Karl Popper's Philosophy of Science. Yeah? And this is a sequel to the earlier one, which was on logical positivism, 2nd week, and the 1st week was just sort of a general overview of the whole series of lectures, yeah? Where I mentioned about introducing Western philosophy of science and then comparing it with Islamic perspectives on science. Yeah? Okay, so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Western philosophy of science and how many of you have heard of the name Karl Popper. Yeah. Last week, I spoke on logical positivism and the Vienna Circle and the Berlin Group. Again, some of you might be familiar and some might not. Yeah. So I'm not assuming any background knowledge on this. Yeah. Although some might appear as technical, but I'll try to simplify it as far as I can. And Karl Popper is a well-known philosopher of science and also a political philosopher. He also wrote on political philosophy, open society, its enemies, and so on. And he was a 20th century philosopher. I think he died somewhere around 1994 at the age of 92. Yeah. About 6 years younger than Unquasis. Unquasis died at the age of 98. Yeah. Well, Mahathir, we don't know yet. Okay. Well, so Karl Popper's philosophy was quite dominant in the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century. And this despite the influence of logical positivism. In fact, Popper directly engaged with the logical positivists and criticized their philosophy of science and put forward his own philosophy of science, which was then later challenged by Thomas Kuhn, which is the subject of next week's lecture. Yeah? Okay, let me move on to the next slide. This is the outline of my lecture for tonight. The background and context to Popper's philosophy of science, Popper's criticism of logical positivism. As I've said, he did directly engage with the logical positivists. And then I will introduce his concept of falsificationism, which distinguishes his philosophy from that of logical positivism. And then Popper's concept of scientific change in science, in the history of science. The fact that scientific theories do change and they have philosophical implications. Yeah? And then the idea of theory change and how that is supposed to bring us closer to the truth. And here Popper uses a technical concept known as verisimilitude. Yeah? And then I'll move on to various criticisms that have been made against Popper's philosophy of science. And the next one is on putting it in a larger scheme of things, a big picture, Popper's philosophy in the context of the Cold War, and Popper's attempt to not only project philosophy of science in the mode of the Enlightenment, but also to project his own liberal philosophy against totalitarianism and fascism and socialism also, through the use of the philosophy of critical rationalism, which is also found in his philosophy of science. Yeah? And lastly, I will discuss the implications of Popper's philosophy of science for the discourse on science and religion. Yeah? Okay, so Popper's philosophy of science is not without its own context. Yeah? And here we have to look at the background, especially the social and political development during his time, that, to my mind, helped to influence and shape his own philosophy of science. So in a sense, he was responding to the philosophical issues of the time, issues raised by the logical positivists, by Marxism even, and other intellectual developments like the rise of psychoanalysis and psychology associated with figures like Sigmund Freud and so on. By the way, Sigmund Freud was also an Austrian from Vienna. Okay, now Popper's relationship to logical positivism. Yeah? He was not actually a member of the Vienna Circle, but he was acquainted with them. Yeah, I mean, I believe he has attended a few of the meetings, yeah? Although he does not consider himself as an official or formal member of the group. Yeah? But being in Vienna, of course, he was in contact with the members of the Vienna Circle. Yeah? And although he shared their Enlightenment ideals, in terms of privileging science intellectually and socially and culturally, that means putting forth science as the only form of knowledge that is legitimate and acceptable, yeah, intellectually and culturally. That should form the basis of modern society. That was the mission of the Enlightenment, and that was what Popper himself sought to establish with regards to scientific knowledge. So in that sense, in the sense of sharing the Enlightenment ideals, which the logical positivists also had, they were also in the effort, yeah, to privilege science, to provide a sort of philosophical grounding for science, yeah, and therefore put science on a pedestal, yeah, just like what the Enlightenment philosophers believed in, yeah, that modern society, modern culture should be based on science, the scientific method, and on rationality and human reason. Yeah. So he shared the broad ideals of the logical positivists with regard to the Enlightenment aims and ideals. Yeah. But where he differed from the logical positivists is in the means and not in the ends. In other words, his specific philosophy of science, yeah, differs from that of logical positivism in certain ways. For example, in terms of their construal of scientific methodology, the logical positivists base themselves on the inductive method, yeah, and on inductive logic, basically. For the logical positivists, science is built from empirical data, and from there, one makes inductive inferences and build concepts from one level to another, as what Rudolf Carnap believed in, until you inductively reach the most comprehensive level, which is the level of scientific theory. Yeah, and this ascent from the empirical base to a comprehensive theory is achieved through the process of logical induction, through the process of through the use of inductive logic. Yeah. And for Popper, this is not correct. He disagreed with the logical positivists, and instead he posed a different methodology known as the hypothetico-deductive method, which is based on deductive rather than inductive logic. Yeah, so this is an example of how Popper differed from the logical positivists, but only, to me, with regards to the means of legitimating science, not with regard to the broader aim of legitimation of science. The project of legitimation of science is common to both. Yeah. So it's, to me, it's more of a product differentiation, marketing strategy. Because had he bought all the ideas of the logical positivists, then he has nothing of his own to project. Yeah? So he has to put forward something different and sell his product in order to be noticed as a philosopher in his own right. Yeah? Although, of course, he defended it quite brilliantly at times. Yeah? And also, part of the background again, he was critical of the development of new knowledge during his time, knowledge such as theories of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was an emerging field at the time, associated with figures like Sigmund Freud, Freud. Those who dislike his psychology or his psychoanalysis called him Sigmund Freud rather than Freud. But that's an aside. And also Carl Gustav Jung, although Jung's psychology was more symbolic, due to symbolism and so on. But it was still considered as part of psychoanalysis. So there were, and Adler and so on. So there were various psychoanalysts coming forth with their own theories in psychology and so on, and claiming scientific status, especially with regards to Sigmund Freud. He claimed that his own theory of psychoanalysis, based on the idea of sexual repression and so on, has a scientific basis to it. It is based on inductive evidence, inductive logic, and empirical evidence, and so on. And that was a new development. And as I've said, they tried to legitimize their fields of knowledge, which is newly emerging in terms of science, by claiming that it is scientific in nature. It possesses the characteristics of the scientific method. Yeah? And apart from psychoanalysis, there was Marxism and Marxist social theories. Yeah? As we know, Karl Marx was also in the business of formulating social theories and making predictions about the future society, where he said that eventually we will end up with a classless society. The whole world will become socialist. Yeah? And again, Marx claimed scientific status for his own social theories. Yeah? So that was the challenge. There was a background, and in fact, it presented an intellectual and cultural challenge to someone like Karl Popper, who does not believe in this sort of claims. To him, it's what he called pseudo-scientific and bogus, basically. But he has to show it. He has to show it through his own philosophy as to why these are not real science. Yeah. And he was critical of these philosophies, as I've said, of these new disciplines, as I've said. But he need to justify his criticism on the basis of his own philosophy of science. And that is why he developed the idea of falsificationism, as I will explain soon. And also, in terms of political philosophy, Popper, although initially he was infatuated with Marxism and socialism, and in fact joined a socialist group, but that infatuation did not last long, and he eventually left socialism and embraced wholeheartedly liberalism and liberal democracy. And in fact, his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, 2 volumes, is basically an attack of socialism and totalitarianism and a defense of liberalism and democracy. And this orientation in Popper's philosophy, political philosophy, did influence his own philosophy of science. So they are interrelated, they're intertwined. One cannot see them in isolation or as 2 separate entities. There is a holistic structure to the whole philosophical thinking with regards to both philosophy of science as well as political philosophy in Popper's own philosophy. Yeah? Okay, next, as I've said, he took the logical positivists head on. Yeah, and I admire him for this because, you know, he was alone in this task. Yeah, and the logical positivists, as I've said earlier, was a group of philosophers, a group of scholars. Yeah, so the analogy that I can think of here is Bruce Lee fighting a group of thugs. You know, although you can't say the logical positivists are thugs, but imagine, you know, in Bruce Lee films, as you have seen, I'm sure some of you have seen Bruce Lee films. There is this one guy who is a martial arts expert, kung fu expert, who's able to defeat, you know, 10 opponents and so on. So Popper is something like that. He took on this group of philosophers, challenged them, yeah, and claimed that he had defeated their philosophy. Yeah. And one of the things that Popper was dissatisfied with logical positivism, is not so much the articulation of logical empiricist philosophy of science, you know, based on logic and empiricism and so on. That's not what bothered him. Yeah. What bothered him was the failure of logical positivism to demarcate science from pseudoscience. I.e., to him, it's a serious problem that these newly emerging fields like psychoanalysis and Marxist social theories and even astrology were claiming scientific status. Whereas to him, they do not merit scientific claim to scientific status. Yeah. And Popper, in fact, has a strong term for these newly emerging fields. He calls them pseudoscience. Yeah. Pseudo basically means fake or imitation. That's why I used to tell my students, you know, if someone says that you are pseudo-intellectual, don't be proud. You know, don't just take the word intellectual. You must take the word pseudo more seriously. Yeah. So pseudo means basically fake, imitation. So if something is pseudoscience, that means it's not genuine science. Yeah? It appears to be science, but in actual fact, it's not. Yeah. And Popper wants a philosophy of science. He wants to develop a philosophy of science that could provide a demarcation between science and pseudoscience. And for him, the the philosophy that could do this is the philosophy of falsificationism. Yeah, and I will explain what is falsificationism soon. And why is it that logical positivism could not screen out, could not separate out genuine science from pseudoscience? Why is it that Popper said that logical positivism will only allow pseudoscience to claim scientific status? Why is this so? The reason is that these newly emerging fields like psychoanalysis, for example, like Freud psychology and so on, they claim that their theories are inductively supported by the empirical data, which is exactly what the logical positivists say science is about. Anything which satisfies these basic methodological criteria of having an empirical base and using that empirical base to inductively generate more general theories would be considered as fulfilling the scientific method, as having adopted the scientific method. Yeah? And that is what people like Sigmund Freud claim. You know? Sigmund Freud said, well, I have lots of clinical data from my patients. Yeah? So, you know, the famous couch, you know, psychoanalyst, the patient would come and then lie down on the couch, and then the psychoanalyst would talk to this patient, you know, ask him questions or her questions, and he or she will then answer these questions. And the psychoanalyst will then record down the responses given, yeah, and use these as clinical data. Yeah. So Freud would then say that, well, I formulate my theories about neurosis being caused by sexual repression and so on from the clinical evidence that I've gathered from my patients through interviews which I've conducted with my own patients. Yeah. And, well, keeping aside the fact that Freud ended up mad in the end, but at least when he was sane, that's what he claimed. Yeah, that psychoanalysis is based on a scientific method and therefore qualifies as science. Yeah. So the logic is simple. So that, well, my field is based on the scientific method, empirical collection of empirical data and making inductive inference from the data in terms of some theoretical generalization. And the same thing was said by Karl Marx when he formulated his scientific socialism and social theories, which he claimed to have scientific status. And Karl Marx makes prediction based on those social theories and so on, claiming that, you know, the world would one day end up being a socialist world where there is a classless society, and there is a scientific basis for that. So Popper, as I've said, was critical of socialism and totalitarianism. He associated totalitarianism with socialism, especially when you look at countries like Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution and so on, under Lenin and Stalin. They were totalitarian states. Yeah? And so there was a destruction of human freedom. There was no human freedom under those kinds of totalitarian regimes. Yeah? So Popper was very critical of what had happened in Russia and later on in China, where to him, human freedom has been robbed by the state. So his more immediate task was to formulate a philosophy of science that would show that these kind of theories are really not scientific in nature, but pseudo-scientific. Yeah. So he took the problem of demarcation between science and pseudoscience to be a more fundamental problem as compared to the theory of meaning, which was the focus of the logical positivists. For the logical positivists, the fundamental problem in philosophy or in philosophy of science is the problem of meaning, and to differentiate between meaningful discourse and meaningless discourse so that they can rule out metaphysical talk as being meaningless. But for Popper, especially with the kind of situation that had developed during his time, yeah, his more immediate concern was how to rule out these pseudo-scientific claims, pseudo-scientific theories that are masquerading as real science, and therefore seeking legitimacy, seeking acceptance. Yeah? Social theories, Marxist social theories and psychoanalysis and so on. Yeah? So it is against this background that Popper formulated his own philosophy of science, and the name given was falsificationism, because it is based on the idea of falsification as opposed to the idea of verification and confirmation. Previously, with logical positivists, the conventional wisdom was that a theory, in order to be accepted as a valid scientific theory, must be based on empirical evidence. Yeah. And that the theory is verified and strongly supported and confirmed by the empirical evidence. Yeah. So the empirical data confirms, or rather confers, support, provide support to the theoretical generalizations. Yeah. And the idea in carrying out observations or experiments and so on is to prove that the theory is true. Yeah. So science is basically an attempt to formulate knowledge through scientific theories, through the use of empirical data and also inductive logic. Yeah? And that the aim of the whole exercise in a scientific inquiry is to prove that the theory is true based on the empirical evidence. So on one hand, you have theory, and on the other hand, you have the empirical evidence which provides support to the theory. And support in the sense that it shows that the theory is true or likely to be true. Likely because of what has been described as the theory of confirmation. Carnap converts from verificationism to confirmation, the idea of confirmation, because absolute verification is impossible because of the gap between empirical base and the theoretical generalization. And the problem of induction. So for Carnap, you can only say that the theory is confirmed to a certain degree with a probability of 0.8, for example, by the empirical data. Now, this was the conventional wisdom before Popper. But for Popper, according to him, no matter how much empirical evidence you gather, you cannot really use that to claim that the theory is true, or even true to a certain extent with a probability of so and so. That's what Carnap and the others have argued in terms of logic of confirmation. Because for Popper, the amount of relevant data is potentially infinite. And therefore, no matter how much evidence you gather, against the background of infinite empirical data, the probability will end up being zero. So anything divides by a number which is close to infinity will give you zero. So the probability, which is the degree of confirmation, will end up being zero. That's Popper's argument. Yeah? So Popper said that this doesn't work. It doesn't wash. Inductive inference doesn't wash. But what you can deduce from the theory and from empirical testing and experimental tests and so on is that the theory is false if it is tested against the empirical data, and that the empirical data does not support it. Then you can say for sure that the theory is false. Yeah. So for Popper, you can know for sure, you can prove for sure that the theory is false, but you cannot prove for sure that the theory is true. And the logic is basically simple. Let me explain this here. For example, you take the general statement, the universal statement, all crows, bird, Malay burung gagak, all crows are black. All crows are black means all crows have black feather. Yeah? Now, no matter how many crows you observe, you cannot be sure that the conclusion or the general statement that all crows are black is true. This is because all crows refer to all crows in the world. And not only in terms of space, but also in terms of time, meaning to say that future crows that have not been born yet and past crows. So it's impossible to verify absolutely the truth of a general statement like all crows are black based on your observations, empirical observations. Yeah. But on the other hand, if you observe one crow that is not black in color, let's say it's an albino crow, then you can be sure that the general statement, all crows are black, is false. Right? So there is an asymmetry between proving a theory true and proving a theory false. You can prove that a theory is false just by one counter evidence, counter example, but you cannot prove it true no matter how much evidence or data you gather. Because no amount of data can prove the statement, all crows are black, to be true. Because it's impossible for you to make observations of all crows. Because this would mean all crows in every part of the world, and also crows that are yet to be born. So for Popper, what we can be sure of is the falsity of a theory, when a theory is false. And it's easy because all you need is one counter evidence, one counter example, one instance in which cannot be reconciled with the theory. And that's enough to show it false, to prove it false. And with regards to the idea of falsification, which he then used as a criteria for demarcating science and pseudoscience, is to say that a theory can only be considered as a scientific theory if it is a falsifiable theory. That means the theory can be proven false, not only that it can be proven true. You see, that's the point that I was saying about what the logical positivists were saying, that theories are meant to be proven true. You try to prove that your theory is true through your experiments and empirical observations. But for Popper, that's not the mark of a scientific theory. The mark of a scientific theory is that it should, in principle, be capable of being proven false. In other words, if it is tested against the empirical data or through experimentation, then there is a possibility that the experimental results or the observation produce results that contradict what the theory predicts. In other words, it can prove the theory false. So there's a potential for the theory to be proven false. Yeah. Now, you might think that this is obvious, but for Popper, it is not. Why is it so? Well, according to Popper, some theories, and he gave examples like theories in psychoanalysis and also Marxist social theories, always defend themselves and protect themselves from being proven false through all sorts of maneuvers. Some of it are ad hoc in nature. That means you cannot prove your theory to be wrong. Yeah. And Popper claims that psychoanalytic theories and Marxist social theories are like that. Yeah. Whenever someone points out an evidence that supposedly contradicts the theory, there's always a reply which effectively defends the theory and protects it from being falsified. Yeah. So for Popper, if that is the case, then it's not a scientific theory, because it does not explicitly lays down conditions for its falsity, conditions that would prove that it is false. Yeah. Whereas a scientific theory is not like that, according to Popper. For example, in physics, yeah, if you have a theory, let's say electromagnetic theory, and you say that when electrons pass through an electromagnetic field, it will be deflected in a certain direction. Let's say, for sake of argument, let's say you say that the electron beam would be reflected to the right when it passes after it passes the electromagnetic field. And if you find experimentally, after carrying out the experiment, you find that instead of turning right, the electron beam turns left, then you would say that the theory has been falsified, because what it predicts is contradicted by the experimental results. And that's what happens in science. In science, if you have a theory and you carry out an experiment based on that theory, and the result turns out to be different, then the theory is not accepted. It is a false theory. So theories like theories in physics, for example, are falsifiable. And this is quite characteristic of all scientific theories, that when you carry out experiments in order to test the theory, it's not only possible for the theory to be proven true inductively, but also there's a possibility that the theory can be proven false. Yeah. And for Popper, pseudo-scientific theories do not have this property. In other words, they are exempt from falsification. So, like, for example, Marxist social theory, which claims that, for example, everything can be explained in terms of class struggle. And then a historian points out that, there are certain episodes in the past that cannot be explained in terms of class struggle. For example, the Crusades. The Crusades is considered as a holy war by both the Christians and the Muslims. Yeah. So how are you going to explain that in terms of class distinction, class interest? Is it a battle between two economic classes? No, it's an ideological battle between those who believe in one religion as opposed to those who believe in another religion, Islam and Christianity. So the Crusades, for example, would be used as an example of historical evidence that goes against Marx's claim in terms of class struggle. But for the Marxists, he would not accept such criticisms. He would try to defend it by saying that there is an element of economic class also in relation to the two social groups that were at war. Yeah. So for Popper, this is quite typical of theories which are not really scientific, but which want scientific status. Yeah, they are basically ideologies for Popper. Yeah, and the same thing with psychoanalysis. He says that it does not issue an unambiguous prediction. Yeah? For example, a theory about human behavior says something about human behavior, and then you find that there's an example of a human act that does not fit into the theory, and then the psychoanalyst would then try and cover it up by giving some other explanation. So for Popper, science is really quite an ethical field of inquiry, in the sense that it is quite transparent and it openly admits its own fault, its own falsity in the face of the empirical evidence. Yeah. Unlike, let's say, all these other belief systems that are always trying to protect itself from being proven false. Yeah. So for Popper, the mark of a true science, of a true scientific field, is its ability to be proven false rather than to be proven true. Yeah. So Popper brought about a revolution in thinking with regard to the notion of what is scientific and what is not scientific in this respect. Yeah. And of course, it has implications for other belief systems too. And since this is a talk which is related to, science, religion, and Islam and so on, so I'm bringing in the relevance here. What's the relevance? The relevance is that this will also mean that religious beliefs have a sort of an inferior epistemological status, because by definition, religious beliefs cannot be challenged. They are dogmas. Yeah. If you reject them, or you sort of, use your intellectual powers in order to criticize them and prove them false, then you are already outside the fold. You are no longer a member of the religious community. Yeah. So you always try to defend that belief system. So, but by so doing, Popper would then imply that these religious beliefs cannot claim any scientific status at all, or tries to project itself as being in the scientific spirit, like, for example, Maurice Bucaille was saying about, how a Quran is proven by science and so on. So for Popper, religionists cannot bring in science and the scientific image in order to support their religious belief. Yeah, that I think is what one would eventually end up if one adopts Popper's falsificationism. Yeah? Okay. Now, Popper dealt quite extensively with the notion of, or with the phenomena of theory change in science. What is meant by theory change in science? Well, it refers to the phenomenon, the fact that in the history of science, we find that scientific theories have changed from one theory to another. Yeah. For example, in astronomy, you have a change from the old Ptolemaic theory to the new Copernican theory. I have it somewhere, but somehow it's not. We seem to have the wrong slide. Yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah. The change from Ptolemaic theory to Copernican theory, and the change from Newton's theory to Einstein's theory. These are examples of theory change in science, which means to say that if you live during the time of Ptolemy or before Copernicus, you would believe that the world is at the center of the universe and everything else revolves around the earth. Yeah? Because Ptolemy's theory says that Earth is the center of the universe. You would believe that to be true. That's true in terms of astronomical theory. But after the 17th century, they have abandoned Ptolemy's theory and accepted Copernicus' theory, which says that it's not the Earth that is the center, but the Sun, which is the center of the solar system. Yeah, and the rest, the planets and so on, revolve around the Sun. So there's a theory change in astronomy. In physics, there's a theory change from Newton to Einstein's theory. So it's a fact that if you look at the history of science, scientific knowledge does not remain static. They evolve over time. The same thing with theories of light. Initially it was a particle theory, and then it was a wave theory, and then back to particle, and then back to wave, and then you end up having a dual theory of light, which says that light is both particle and wave. Yeah. So now what's the significance of this phenomena of theory change in science? Let's go back to the earlier slide. And why was Popper very concerned about this? No. Okay. Why Popper is concerned about this is because of the argument known as pessimistic induction, which could be exploited by critics of science and by religionists in order to dismiss science and scientific belief as something which is tentative and not absolute, in the sense that it makes it then optional for you to believe or not believe in a scientific theory. There's no intellectual compulsion. Why? Well, because if it is true that theories have always changed in the past, then it might be possible for theories to change in the future. This is known as pessimistic induction. Induction is, if it's true for X, it's true for X plus 1. And if it's true for N, it's true for N plus 1 in mathematics. That's what is meant by induction in mathematics. So the same thing here. When you say pessimistic induction, you mean to say that if it is true that theories have changed in the past, it could also be true that theories change in the future. In other words, you are not obliged to accept current scientific theories as true eternally. In other words, for example, if you don't like Darwin's theory, you can just say, well, what is there to guarantee that in future there won't be any more changes with regard to Darwin's theory or a biological theory, like in the field of, theory about human origin and so on? Isn't it possible that in future new evidence would come up and show that Darwin's theory was false and you have it replaced with another theory? Yeah. So that's the implication that Popper wants to block or to deal with, yeah, in order to preempt this possible misuse of the pessimistic induction, to forestall any trust in scientific belief. Yeah. And Popper's strategy with this, in this regard, is to show that scientific change does not necessarily lead to that kind of negative conclusion. Yeah. There are many positive things associated with scientific change. So that's why I put the title to my slide here, Popper on the positivity of scientific change. Yeah? So he tried to show that scientific change actually can be rationally justified. And also the change shows the rationality of science. And the change also shows that scientists make a rational decision. Why? Because the new theory is better than the old theory. The new theory has stronger evidence in support of it, and is more logically sound and so on and so forth. Yeah? So that proves the rationality of science. So scientific change is used by Popper in order to argue for the rationality of science, that scientists do make a rational choice in changing from an old theory to a new theory because they are making a better choice, choosing a better theory. Yeah? And also, other positive things about theory change is that when theories change, according to Popper, when theories change, they move from a theory which has less truth content to a theory which has greater truth content. So much so that when theories change, they progress towards the truth. So Popper is saying that change is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Why? Because it shows that science is making progress. Yeah. So forget about this pessimistic induction, which shows that scientific change leads to a negative conclusion, like, for example, we are not bound to believe in that scientific theory and the scientific theory because tomorrow it might be proven false and so on. So it says, forget about that sort of argument. Think about the positive side of it. That when theories change, they change to a better theory and they progress towards the truth. Yeah. So there is an element of progress in science, which is something which is absent in other fields. Like, for example, in religion, there is no change, but then it also means that there is no progress. In order for a field of knowledge to progress, then there must be some changes to it. Yeah. And in order to provide sort of a philosophical grounding to this notion of theory change leading to progress and truth, Popper developed a concept of verisimilitude. Yeah. In other words, in his theory of verisimilitude, a scientific theory consists of two parts, namely a part consisting of true statements and a part consisting of false statements. Yeah. Or you can say that from the theory, you can deduce a set of statements, a total set of statements where part of it are true statements and part of it are false statements. So the verisimilitude is measured in terms of the difference between truth content and falsity content. Yeah? If a theory has more truth content as compared to falsity content, then it has greater verisimilitude. So let's say you have a theory A, which is the old theory. It has true statements and false statements, but the distribution is like this, for example. I'm just giving a pictorial diagrammatic representation, which does not really give you the actual percentages because, it's hypothetical at this stage, yeah? But for the sake of argument, you can think of it this way. Yeah? So the amount of true statements is diagrammatically, at least in terms of, by just looking at the picture, you can see that it's less than the amount of false statements. Yeah? But when it changes to a new theory B, the truth content increases and the falsity content decreases. So you can say that there has been an increase in verisimilitude, in Popper's concept of verisimilitude. Yeah. So theory progress leads to more and more truth and less falsity. Yeah. Progression towards the truth. So that shows that theory change in science is only something which proves that science is progressive, and that it will end up giving us the truth, the absolute truth about the world. Right? So even though we might not have that absolute truth now, but as time goes on, we might end up getting there someday. Yeah? Okay, but the problem is that Popper's theory of verisimilitude has been criticized and shown to be untenable because this is a technical thing in mathematical logic. Yeah, the argument is this, or rather, the criticism of Popper's theory of verisimilitude is this: because for Popper, all theories that are present in science today have some amount of falsity content. That means we have not achieved absolute truth yet. So that means that there is no theory which is absolutely true. But in terms of mathematical logic, if a theory has some falsity content, no matter to what degree, then you cannot compare them and say that theory A, for example, is better than theory B, or theory B is better than theory A. Because all theories with falsity content are similar in rank. Why? Because they have false statements in them, or you can derive false statements from them. So anything which has falsity in it cannot lead to the judgment that one theory is not better than another. This is a result in mathematical logic. Yeah, I leave you at that. And then there is another criticism made about Popper's logic of falsificationism. Yeah? Let me try to enlarge this slide. Now, according to Popper's earlier presentation of the theory of falsification, you have a theory making a prediction. Yeah, T entails, or from T you can derive a statement E, which can be empirically tested. Yeah, that's your premise one. Premise two, you carry out the experiment and you find that the result is not E, which is different from the one the theory predicts. Yeah. And in terms of deductive logic, the conclusion that you are entitled to make is that T is false. Yeah. So this is what is known as modus tollens, yeah? in deductive logic, modus tollens. If P then Q, premise number one, premise number two, not Q, conclusion, therefore not T. So the same applies here. T implies E, not E, then not T. That was what we are made to believe by Popper's notion of falsificationism, yeah? Or falsification. But Lakatos, who initially was a follower of Popper, showed that what is really involved is not T alone being tested, but T in conjunction with or together with a set of what is known as auxiliary hypotheses, or a set of other assumptions that you make in making the prediction E. Yeah. So for example, when you test a theory, you are also testing with it, together with it, a set of other assumptions. Like to give you a simple example. Eh? For example, in mechanics, yeah, you have a problem, and then you make the assumption, assume that there is no friction, for example. So that assumption that we say that there is no friction is your hypothesis, your auxiliary hypothesis. Or, for example, you want to test a particular chemical element and see what its properties are. And there you make the assumption that it is not contaminated with something else. So it's not just a theory that is being tested, but you have to make some of the assumptions together with that theory in order to come up with your empirical prediction. Yeah. And what happens is that if you get the result not E, then the conclusion that logic will allow you to make, deductive logic will allow you to make, is not T in conjunction with H. Yeah. The whole thing, the whole set, T and H. So that you end up not knowing which is false, whether it is T or is H. It could be that T is true, but H is false, which leads to an overall falsity of T and H. Yeah. So this is a logical criticism about Popper's theory of falsification. Huh? Okay. Now I haven't got the time to explain everything, but just let me briefly conclude by saying that Popper's attempt to provide a meta-narrative of the legitimation of science, try to give a philosophical grounding to validate and philosophically justify scientific knowledge, using the idea of falsificationism as opposed to verificationism or confirmation by the logical positivists, also ended up in failure. And the failure is due to three things. Number one, problem faced by falsificationism. The logic of falsification, as I said, is faulty. The failure of the theory of verisimilitude, as shown by the mathematical logicians. And also, this is sort of a broad criticism, but quite serious. Criticism which says that Popper's philosophy eventually leads to some form of skepticism. Why is that so? Well, because his idea of falsification says that we can only know what is false, but not what is true. So if we cannot know what is true knowledge, then there is basically skepticism. Skepticism basically says that we cannot have true knowledge. Yeah. And it's the same as what Popper is saying, that Popper says that we cannot know when we have achieved truth, when we have achieved the true theory, absolutely true theory. But we can know when our theories are false. So you end up saying that we cannot be sure that we have true knowledge. Yeah. And in fact, that is what Popper himself admitted. He said that his philosophy is known as fallibilism, fallible, from the word fallible. He says that he believes in fallibilism. He believes that our knowledge is merely tentative. We can only hold a belief tentatively. We cannot say for sure that we have true knowledge. So, for most people, this implies skepticism. Yeah, so you end up not believing in anything for sure. You only have set of tentative beliefs. Yeah, and you can't really sort of hang on to that because it's like a weak straw because it's tentative. Yeah. Okay, so on that note, I end tonight's lecture. And as I've said, you can collect your questions and ask me at the end of the series of lectures. Yeah? Okay, I hand it back to Sharan.
Thank you so much, Prof. I still remember in previous classes you said we Muslims are safe from this what I call fallacy that everything is uncertain, everything is subject to question. We have protection. I mean, from the revelation that Muslims do not suffer from this kind of dilemma. Thank you so much, Prof. We look forward for next week's class. Thank you, everyone. Inshallah, as Prof said, please post your question on the chat box, or you can just write it and keep it with you. On the week 8, we can discuss everything, inshallah. Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay.